Good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us again this evening. Today we are having conversation number 4 as part of this Doctoral Conversations alumni series. And we couldn't be more delighted because Dr. Manveen Singh, our very own Professor Manveen, is here with us this evening. Actually, you and I, Manveen, we've worked together for a long time now, and when we were when we were planning this series, and I suddenly realized you're also an alum now, I was like, that's interesting. So delighted to have this conversation with you today and learn from you. So just to recap a little bit, we started the series on Monday with the question, doctoral studies, when, where, and why. Then on Tuesday, we had a chat about how to get the application process right and what goes into that. Then yesterday, we had Diksha Mohanty from Oxford who talked about the early phase of the doctoral program and what the stakes are there and what surprises, pressures, etc., kick in at that kind of phase. And now here with you today, we want to discuss method and mentorship. So the first thing I would like to ask you is about mentorship, Manveen. And could you tell us there how much was working with a specific scholar or supervisor? How much of a factor was that in your choice of institution and then what you decided to do your research on? And what would be kind of your top tips, your advice in terms of maximizing the supervision that is available in the doctoral studies? So over to you.
Right. Thank you so much. At the very outset, I would want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to kind of share my experiences, that I have had over the last 3.5 to 4 years, and there couldn't be a better forum than this to basically, have a sort of an interaction with people who might be looking to pursue their doctorate anytime soon. So as far as your question goes, look, I personally had heard a lot about how important the role of your PhD supervisor is as far as your PhD is concerned, and more importantly, as far as the journey after that is concerned, because that very individual is supposed to be the guiding light for you, not only for that period, but also for what comes after that. And a lot of things have been said about, the ability of a candidate to actually sail through these 3 to 5 years, depending on where you are doing your PhD from. But I personally feel that you need to actually be sure of, firstly, who is the right person for you before you approach that person, because there are 2 possible routes that might appear in front of you when you are about to pursue your PhD. Number 1, you will not be given an option to choose your supervisor, and the supervisor will be allocated to you or allotted to you based on your topic and based on the expertise of a particular person or a particular academic. The second route is where you are supposed to, prior to putting in your application, approach a particular academic at an institution and then share what you wish to do your PhD on or your tentative proposal, and then see what sort of an interest the person has in supervising you or supervising your research, or if at all, he or she is asking you to tweak your topic a little bit for them to be in a position to supervise you to the best of their abilities. So one is if you choose or if you are faced with the first option, you are prepared to basically, work with anyone who's assigned to you as your supervisor. Now, here is where the task gets a little tough, because there would be reasonable as well as unreasonable expectations of you. Now, it's not important whether you feel it's unreasonable or not. The other person might feel it's absolutely reasonable, because that's how a PhD is supposed to be. So you have to have your A game on all the time. But more importantly, patience. Patience to see it through, patience to accept when you are being criticized, and that's going to happen 90% of the times. Let me be brutally honest here, that you're going to be criticized 90% of the times. Because if somebody is telling you, oh, this is brilliant, absolutely wonderful, out of the world, there's something wrong. There is definitely something wrong, because a candidate is supposed to be criticized for whatever the candidate is doing, because that is going to go a long way in preparing you for your defense. Because there people are going to butcher you left, right, and center, and you will have nowhere to run, and nobody's going to shield you. Everywhere else, your supervisor will shield you, but in the defense, the supervisor is merely a spectator. So, which is why treat your supervisor as the most important person in your life for those 3 or 4 years. Whatever your supervisor says, have a constructive dialogue. Don't counter what the person is saying, because that's not going to take you anywhere. And appreciate the fact that the person is your supervisor for a reason. You are on one side of the fence, the other person is on the other side of the fence for a reason. And you cannot doubt that. So, to sum it all up, the supervisor is supposed to be your God for 3 to 4 years, till the time you're doing your PhD. And be prepared to accept that you have made mistakes, you are making mistakes, and you will continue to make mistakes till the time you defend your thesis successfully. I mean,
oh my God. Yeah. Finish. So yeah, so I love what you just said, because I mean, this is something that we've of course talked about, the temperament and the mindset that you need, going into a doctoral program and seeing it through over the past like 3 conversations. But one thing you touched on, which I really love is, and which we hadn't heard about before, is the element of like humility that you need, right? It's not, and the way you put it, it's not just taking feedback in a very kind, having a good attitude about feedback. It's actually what you're talking about is having a really sort of inherent humility going into it, right? Which is two slightly different things. One thing I wanted to ask you is, let's assume, like you talked about these 2 different scenarios. One is where you don't get to pick your supervisor and they're assigned to you, and one is where you seek prior approval of the supervisor before even applying, right?
Yeah.
What happens when you have your sort of your heart set on working with somebody, and for whatever reason you don't get to work with them as they don't get to be your supervisor for whatever reason? How can you still, are there any ways in which, like, presumably their work has influenced you, right? Are there any ways in which you can still get mentorship from them, or can still be influenced by their work without them being your supervisor?
Well, I think that's a very, very, very smart yet important question. And here is what I feel about it. If there is someone who you have your heart set on in terms of being you're wanting to be mentored by that person, right? Primary supervisor probably could be someone else, but then there are certain cases where you could possibly put in a request for that person to be assigned as your secondary supervisor, if institutions allow you to have a secondary supervisor from outside of that particular institution. It also depends on whether the person is within the institution or outside the institution. Because if the person is within the institution, it shouldn't really be a problem, to be honest, provided the person also consents. That's one. Because it's only a secondary supervisor's position. It's not primary. If it's primary and you are recommending someone, whereas there is no possibility for you to recommend or there is no such procedure, then there might be eyebrows raised. But if it's a secondary supervisor's position, your primary supervisor doesn't have a problem, that person doesn't have a problem, the institution, well, I don't really think so, would create any obstacle in your not being able to get that person as your secondary supervisor. So that's the only way possible. However, if everything is lost, well, everything is still not lost, because that person could still mentor you or could offer his or her advice to you or guidance to you in an informal capacity, which I've seen happening a lot. So luckily for me, I got someone as my supervisor who, of course, I didn't have an option to pick, but there couldn't have been a better supervisor. And there is not one or two or three, but there are probably around 20 odd reasons where I can point out, or why I can point out, that probably I couldn't have wished for a better supervisor. And as we go on with the conversation, I will be happy to disclose why I'm saying what I'm saying right now.
How about now?
Okay.
Actually, let me ask you this question based on what everything that you know now. If you were to advise somebody on what to look for in a supervisor, what would you say?
Okay, wonderful. What I think is that you should firstly have a supervisor who's not very, very busy. In the sense of saying that, of course, these things are not within a candidate's hands all the time, but be sure of the fact that if you have an opportunity, or if you're given this opportunity to pick someone who could supervise you, or whose selection is probably based on what you tell the institution, then in that case, opt for a person who is not over occupied with things, teaching, research, projects, travel, this and that. I would say someone who is, of course, teaching, and parallel to that is also carrying out his or her research, but then has the time to guide you, to mentor you, to talk to you, to assuage your concerns as and when it's required, right? Rather than what I've seen sometimes happening is the supervisor will meet you once, and then the supervisor will tell you, okay, you please go ahead and do your work, and we'll connect probably in 6 months time or after this semester. Now, here is what is likely to happen. 2 months down the line from that particular meeting with your supervisor, you hit a dead end. Your brain has stopped working. You're not understanding what to do. And words are basically just hovering over your head, and you're not able to put them together in a sentence. Not even a sentence. Or probably one sentence took you a whole day to frame. And that has happened with me. Let me be honest here. That has happened with me. But why I was lucky? Because I could call up my supervisor, tell him I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. And he said, it's okay, calm down. Let's meet over coffee tomorrow. Tomorrow. That is what the availability was over 3.5 years. Not 3.5 months, 3.5 years, the availability looked like that. A phone call, a message, probably crossing paths on campus, and telling him, I struggled a lot yesterday because I was trying to put something together, of course, related to the topic that I was working on. And the reaction is so cool and calm that for a moment you are forced to rethink, well, did I really need to tell him? Because the reaction was, well, I didn't expect that. So, it makes a hell lot of a difference if somebody is available for you when you want that person the most. And at that time, no friend is going to probably come to your rescue because you don't really need a friend. No colleague is going to come to your rescue because you don't really need a colleague. This I'm talking with respect to the phase when you are writing, not when you are framing your proposal. It's possible while you're framing your proposal as well, but mostly during writing, because that's where people get stuck. And the supervisor will be the go-to person for you. And if there what you get to hear is, we'll meet next week. Then next week comes, I'm busy, we'll meet 2 weeks later. That's not going to help. Mentally, that's not going to help. For certain people, that might be okay because the person is probably meeting you maybe once in 2 to 3 months, which you feel is okay because you can manage. But it's not really about the progress in terms of your work. It's about the mental stability during a doctorate or during the writing phase, which is very, very important. Because I heard this particular thing, which I'm going to tell you right now. And I really didn't believe in it till the time I found myself in the same position. Every PhD candidate will have a breakdown at some point in time during your doctorate. If you don't have that, you are doing something wrong. It is not a cakewalk, and it is not supposed to be a cakewalk. It doesn't matter where that obstacle is going to come, and you're going to feel that you are better off leaving it or postponing it for a while. But it will come, and you have to overcome that obstacle. And who's the most important person who's going to allow you or who's going to help you to overcome that? Your supervisor, not your spouse, not your parents, not your siblings, not your friends, not even your colleagues, your supervisor. Because he's equally invested in your work. Nobody else is. Everybody else has expectations. But the supervisor is the only person who is looking towards you and who can see that, okay, 1 year or 2 years or 3 years down the line, this person is going to defend his or her thesis, and I'm going to be a happy man or a happy woman because I would have successfully finished supervising this person's work. And ultimately, it will all boil down to the fact that it was a successful supervision over a period of 3 to 4 years. That's the point. Now coming to the fact that you asked me, why should I not now explain why the supervisor's role is very important, or why I feel I was very lucky? I was very lucky because one was the fact that my supervisor was approachable, phone call, text, so on and so forth. Second, 97,484 words is the length of my thesis. Okay. Every single word has been proofread, and there is a tick mark on every word. I can show that document. It's somewhere lying in my laptop. The entire document that was proofread. Every single word has been proofread. And wherever even a full stop or a comma should have been modified, it has been pointed out. You tell me, how many people are there who are going to do that or who have the time to do that? Which is why, in hindsight, if I look back, I have never even seen a peer reviewer give those sort of comments like my supervisor did. I have nothing else to say.
That was extremely well put, Manveen. And I don't know about everyone else who is here, but listening to you say all that makes me imagine that you are going to be a fantastic doctorate supervisor yourself. And actually, I was just thinking, I'm so glad you presented this whole side of it, because I opted for a very light touch supervisory situation. And that was my own kind of choice and my own kind of situation for which it was appropriate. But where I really lucked out and where it really paid off is this person had that same and I'm talking about Professor Jayant Krishnan at Indiana, he had that same kind of interdisciplinary approach to his work, which coming from me, he perfectly understood, right? And not only him, the rest of my committee, as well, Professor Ochoa and Professor Hoffman, they all kind of, it just fell in place in terms of just the the approach to the discipline, right? And how much the boundaries could be pushed. So that's the sense in which, although, for me, the supervisory situation was completely different, that's the sense in which it really all came together. And I highlight this just to say that, while what you said is so applicable to so many people, and really considering the pressure of of doctorate program, what it takes out of you, is so important. There's also, it does not mean that you can't have other kinds of arrangements that might be appropriate on a case by case basis. So before I ask you the next question, I want to invite our attendees to submit their questions via chat or Q&A, and we will get to those in a second. Next, Manveen, I want to ask you really about method and your understanding of it, especially in terms of at what point did you find yourself really thinking about method? Is it something that was very much your starting point, right? Or is it something that you just developed over time?
Right. So method, as we know, for a PhD work or a PhD research is very, very important. Yet at the same time, I would also want to believe that that method or methodology or research methodology, various terms that we use to describe what exactly uh, a person's approach has been towards the completion of the PhD thesis or PhD research is something you should be flexible about, because you cannot have a preconceived mindset when it comes to methodology. And I have actually observed this, or I had observed this prior to my own work getting into full flow, that there were a couple of cases where, when the actual defense happened for the candidate, the committee actually mentioned or questioned the fact as to why there was, for instance, empirical work done. Empirical work was not required. Empirical research for that particular topic was not required, and that it should be reworked upon. Imagine this is happening at the defense stage. So it's not something anybody would want to hear. One of the reasons is because we have our own comfort zones. Let me be honest here. Some people like to carry out empirical work in almost everything. Everything they write, everything they research, everything they talk about, even an op-ed will have empirical research, an op-ed. And on the other hand, you have people who want to stay away or steer clear of empirical research. They're more into, theoretical or doctrinal or sort of an analytical approach, right? Comparative plus analytical, wherein you don't want to get into the empirical stuff. Now, I personally, when I began my journey and I started working on my proposal, there were several stages over which the proposal was revised. And at that point, I actually was clear that I would have to conduct interviews. I would have to go out in the field and talk to people, have conversations, record them, have a set of questions ready, prepare a performer, so on and so forth. But then when I started actually working on my thesis and I wrote a couple of chapters, that's when I realized that this is confidential information. This is information which probably is recorded, but as minutes of the meeting in several organizations which were a part of my research, but it's next to impossible to get access to that. So I had to have a backup plan there. And that backup plan was to ensure that the novelty of my thesis is not compromised if I move away from the aspect of empirical research, get into a sort of a theoretical framework which needs to be framed, and also I stay true to the doctrinal yet analytical approach, which is anyway going to be there as far as the research goes. The point simply being that if you are too rigid with your methodology, which happens to be the case for a lot of candidates, because as I mentioned, someone who wants to write a thesis on economics and law, or the intersection of economics and law, would not do without empirical research. Yet at the same time, if you have a parallel candidate who basically is getting into the nuances of something like intellectual property and a couple of other subjects, or a interdisciplinary sort of an approach, you know, it's quite possible that you could do without the empirical work or empirical analysis. And that's exactly what happened in my case. I soon realized that empirical research was out of question because that was not going to happen. Then I sat down and I thought about what was the best way to move forward without empirical research, so that no one should be able to point out that you are just making arguments for the sake of making arguments without there being any framework or any theoretical backing to what you are saying. And the other aspect was, it was October of 2019. I actually thought I had finished my thesis. All I required was a green signal from the research advisory committee, which was a committee of 3 individuals, 2 people who are not supervising my research as such, but are supposed to be advising me at several instances, at least twice a year in meetings. And then third person was, of course, my supervisor. And then there was a big question that came in front of me. No empirical research, but where is the theoretical framework for the arguments? At first, I couldn't understand that what exactly was meant by this theoretical framework. Then I was explained this entire aspect by my supervisor a day later. And you know what I was supposed to do, or what I was asked to do? Write another chapter to support what all I had done in the other 7 chapters. Because that chapter would be the so-called base for all the arguments to then fall in place. Without that theoretical framework, the building is going to come crashing down when it is either a mock defense or a proper defense. That's a question that's going to come my way. I spent the next 2 months writing the chapter, looking at different disciplines. I don't even remember correctly how many different disciplines I had to look into to find theories and then figure out a way to link those theories with my arguments. Business, economics, sociology, psychology, all of that came together in one chapter over a period of 1.5 months, and then another 15 days spent on incorporating the new comments that had come in on that chapter. At the end of the day, the methodology was all successful because of the theoretical framework, which probably could have been substituted by other things as well. But for a PhD thesis, a theoretical framework is really something which is going to come to your rescue almost always. Because what you're doing essentially is picking up information from here and there, putting it together, and adding your bits here and there, which is your so-called novel bit. But the theoretical framework will always be that so-called absolute novelty in your thesis, which is going to drive home the fact or the point that you've done original, authentic research. So it all came down to being flexible. It all came down to having a backup plan. And let me add something there. When I say about backup plan, we all know 2020 March, COVID stuck bad, real bad. I have another colleague of ours who's in the last phase of her PhD. She was supposed to spend about a year and a half in carrying out the field work. And that's when COVID stuck. You can't go anywhere. Getting people on for an interview is extremely difficult. Availability is a problem. Accessibility is a problem. Your internet is not working. The other person's internet is not working. Your internet speed is low. The other person's internet speed is low. Whatever be the issue, the problem is you will not be able to get what you want. And that's when frustration begins to kick in. And add to it the fact that COVID is already outside. So you don't have anywhere to run. You don't have anywhere to go. You can't go on a holiday for 3 days to refresh yourself. Sitting in the same room, same house, you are thinking, why did I actually adopt this philosophy or this methodology? Why did I not think about probably something else? To be fair, nobody anticipated that COVID was going to kick in the way it did, But having said that, one should always be prepared for these sort of outcomes or eventualities, when you get to a task like a PhD thesis. So a backup plan is always very important. If luck be on your side, you would be able to concur or to achieve what basically you sought out to achieve in the first place. But if there is no backup plan, it's going to delay the PhD defense, or it's going to delay the completion of the PhD, because anything can happen. You don't know who's going to sit in your committee. You don't know who's going to be the person who's going to, just get stuck on a particular point and keep on dragging that particular point to a point of no return, where you have to actually go back and make those huge changes or major changes, as they use the word in case of a PhD defense. Minor changes, major changes, right? Or everything is fine. Well, I mean, you would rather be in a position where there's a backup plan ready. That's my.
It's so amazing, no? It's so amazing to get such a comprehensive glimpse into like how you interpreted method throughout the various stages, right? I mean, it sounds like not only is it important in terms of like how you conduct, quote unquote, conduct your study, because that is the general idea that people have, right? Like method is like deciding how am I going to like do the research, but it's just as important when you are thinking about how am I going to structure my argument, right? Because it's one thing to get your data and to process it and to do all of that, and then it's another to write a piece of work which meets certain standards, right? And which qualifies as a doctoral thesis, which makes a demonstrable contribution to the field, right? And then, as you said, I mean, it's such a risk. Like a methodological commitment can also be such a risk if factors on the ground suddenly, suddenly kind of adversely affect how much you're able to follow through with that. So as we saw in your case, and so of course, thereby the importance of there being a backup plan or a kind of more flexible approach to all of that. There is a chat question in chat right here. Krishna Dev saying, asks, hello, Professor Maneen, very insightful talk, Lee. My question to you is, you mentioned in the beginning that supervisor's role extends beyond the award of doctorate. In general, in which direction can the doctoral work move after that? Can it lead to further papers or perhaps a book? And actually, this is the very thing that I wanted to also kind of ask you now that you've defended what's next.
Right. So, although we are skipping a stage here where we were supposed to probably, I would have wanted to talk a little bit about the defense and the preparation, but anyway, I'm happy.
Actually, why don't we talk about that and then we'll go to this question.
Yeah, I mean,
right now I don't see any other questions.
Yeah, if it's okay to kind of hold on to that question,
Yeah.
Till I actually come to that stage. So, as far as the defense goes, well, one is to just basically take it easy from the stage where all the reviewers, evaluators, comments have come in. You've incorporated everything. It has gone back to them. If at all that is required, they've approved the incorporation of comments. Well, that happened with me in multiple stages because, again, as I mentioned, Corona was pretty much the spoil sport as far as this entire process post the submission of thesis was concerned for me, because of the reviewers' comments. One set of comments were absolutely positive with no major changes required. Very minor, modifications were to be done, which took me very little time. But for one of the other evaluators, what happened was, it's a very interesting story because I got a set of comments which required, uh, again, minor changes. But if you look at it in the context of the comments that came in, very detailed, very comprehensive, looked as if the person has actually read every single word that I've written, just like my supervisor, and then pointed out the faults, right? So, line wise, page wise, everything was pointed out. What needs to be justified, what needs to be clarified, what needs to be changed, so on and so forth. I did that. I also was asked to make an annexure, which I did, which required a decent amount of work on my part because I was supposed to frame an entire policy on my own. I did. I sent it back. There were further changes asked to be made in the policy now. I again did that. Again sent it back. Finally, the green signal came, and then that was the first time I was able to breathe a sigh of relief that, okay, this is done now. I just have to wait for the defense to be scheduled. That again took us more than a month, again because of COVID and the end of the semester and so many things happening. So finally on 17th of June my defense was scheduled last year. In the lead up to that, well, no real preparation, no watching videos on YouTube, nothing. I just let go of everything. I didn't bother about anything in particular. I sat down and I read my thesis 4 times over. That's it. That's all I did. 4 times over, I read my thesis. And I knew everything that I had written. I knew every line on every page, in every chapter, under every heading that I had written. So if somebody was to ask me, what is your opinion on this point, I could literally point out that in this chapter, under this setting, under this heading, I've written this specific thing without looking, of course. That's what I did. Although people would have their own ways of preparing for the Viva, and I'm not in any way discounting all of that or keeping that aside. Well, that's very, very important. Yet at the same time, you need to be very thorough with your thesis, because in your defense you could be asked to justify literally anything and everything, and there you cannot pause in the sense of saying, of course you compose yourself and then begin to answer, but it should seem as if you are confident enough. Your body language should communicate that point to the other person, to your examiners, to the panel, that you are confident enough to answer that and you know what you've done and you are in a position to defend what you've written, which is most important. If I come up with a framework, a theoretical framework, I've coined two theories. Why did I discount all the other existing theories? I'm not a second Einstein in this world, but I was asked to frame two theories to justify what I had done in the remaining 7 chapters. What is so unique about that theory, and why do I think the theory will work? I should know the answers. It can't be that I am just beating around the bush just for the sake of speaking. Substance is what's required. You should be able to actually justify every possible thing that you speak or you've written which is being pointed out in your defense. Stay cool, stay calm, no panicking, nothing. Of course, my defense was not in person. We know COVID couldn't or wouldn't allow that to happen, neither now nor at that time. So it was a virtual defense. But I was sitting in this very room on this very chair and looking at the screen like I am right now and speaking freely whatever I had done, whatever I had written. And I think I was able to convince the panel that whatever I'm saying is making sense. And whatever I've written can actually be implemented as far as the deliverables are concerned, or what is possible going forward for India and for the other countries. So that's what my advice would be. But then again, different people would have different advice for the preparation vis-a-vis your defense. But I personally just made sure I was thorough with my thesis. That's it.
Manveen, I am not at all personally convinced that you're not the second Einstein. I suspect you might be. I suspect you might be. And I loved listening to your story because for me, that was the hardest bit, right? Like I submitted at the end of June last year, and my defense date was set for the 1st of October, also a Zoom defense, almost immediately. So that span of like 3 months between knowing your date and actually the defense date was just a true test of wits, right? I mean, that was just pressure that, that was beyond anything I'd experienced at any other point in my doctoral work. And one thing I noticed during the actual defense was that they were really interested in how I had arrived at certain conclusions and how much I had thought through everything I was saying, right? It wasn't about like, challenging me with lots of other fancy counterpoints or looking for some kind of extra information. Has she looked at this? Has she looked at that? Has that been covered? Has this been looked into? It was just making sure that the things that were said were, I was convinced that I was standing on firm ground when I was saying that. So that's something that also I think is good to understand, is really the whole point of the defense. I think there was also a question, and we just have 1 minute for this. What are you doing with your thesis now? Is it papers? Is it a book?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are various things that you could do, or various paths that you could tread on after you have successfully defended your thesis. But of course, the first thing that you should do is probably take a breather for a month or two at least, and then get to the thinking stage as to what next. But as harsh as it may sound, and this is exactly what my supervisor told me, you need to start working towards the book, because the easiest opportunity for anyone to author a book in his or her life as an academic is when you have actually finished your PhD, successfully defended the same, and have about 100,000 words to put together or modify in the form of a book or a monograph or whatever it may be. Um, I also had a few conversations with a few of my colleagues, here at Jindal, as well as a few of my academic friends around the world, as to what best could be uh, done with my thesis. And what I actually uh, heard from them is that either one could probably let go of the book. So there's various options, as I was mentioning. Either you could let go of the book and just publish probably six separate research papers. If you have written, of course, your thesis in that manner, that every chapter is a la carte research paper, or has a unique identity in itself. Now, the second option is you forget about research papers and just go ahead and modify it and turn it into a book, which could be either a textbook or a research monograph. Well, it really depends on what you've written your thesis on, which will actually determine the outcome of your work, or what sort of a book or what category of book it could be. But usually, I've seen that they cannot be textbooks, so to speak. It always ends up being a monograph of sorts. So that's exactly the path that I have picked. But then I've really not stuck to the second option. I've stuck to the third option. Now that's interesting. I'll tell you what the third option is. The third option is you take out about a couple of chapters from your work, publish them as research papers, and seek permission from the publisher vis-a-vis those two papers, or the content of those two papers being used either partially or completely in your own work in the future. What I mean by that is, just for clarity purposes, if I have filtered out a couple of chapters out of the six major chapters that are there in my thesis, I'm keeping introduction and conclusion aside. Six substantive chapters. Out of six substantive chapters, I pick out two chapters and I publish them in two different journals. And then I seek permission from those two journals with respect to reuse of that work, which usually is not a problem, to be honest. I can say that about US journals for sure, because I've published several papers in US journals, and every time you have that permission, provided you, of course, acknowledge the fact that you first published with them. Second is that that thing is also not a problem with European and British journals. I recently managed to get one chapter in a British journal, and when I was submitting my manuscript, I was very careful about the fact that I first read their policy and the author's permissions or author's rights. That's very important for you to read. So when you read through that, you will find somewhere it's written that you can apply for permission or just sign a sort of a form. There's a separate form that you have to sign, that provided you acknowledge the first publication of that content in the journal, you can actually reuse it either completely or partially in your subsequent work, and that shouldn't be a problem. So I picked the third option, two research papers in two journals. And of course, I recently signed a contract uh, with Springer for my book, which is, again, as I mentioned, gonna be a research monograph. So it would not be possible to come out with a textbook anyway. The topic that I've worked on, or I've researched on, or I've written on, is something which is just not possible to teach as a part of a core course, uh, in terms of intellectual property. So that's definitely going to be an elective course. Nowhere in the world is it taught as a core course. So a textbook is something which is absolutely impossible. So, and I also was suggested by the publisher that a research monograph is what would rather be the best option. And to my surprise, prior to my actually sending my manuscript for publication, I mean, I had already sent one, because with one I wasn't that worried, but I was worried about using two out of six chapters. So when I talked to the publisher, the publisher told me, the one who I was corresponding with, that it's all the more better if you get published in a category journal prior to your book being published, because that will add more value to your work and more value to your book. So absolutely no issue, but make sure you get permission from them for republication or reuse of that work. So as things stand, I'm working on my book, and I've already got two papers published. So one is actually published, is out there in print, um, uh, and the other one has been accepted, but it should be out later this year. So that's already done and dusted. The book I'm going to work on, so there are few changes that I have to make, but then the last and the most important thing, and I'll end with that, is that when you do your PhD work, you're of course working on a niche area. You're working on a niche topic. And it's quite possible that for us lawyers, things change very quickly. Laws get amended uh, like this, So overnight, your thesis is going to turn into sort of a compilation of 300, 400 pages, which is good for nothing, which is just there as a weight of 2.5 kgs, hardbound. That's it, and it'll keep lying in one shelf, But the point is, if you are quick in terms of working on your book, or you start working on your book very quickly and you get it out, before things radically change, it's great, because I learned from my supervisor, and he was the one who inspired me to start working on my book right away. It wasn't an easy task, because to get a book proposal approved, especially for something like this, it takes a decent amount of effort. And with your mind having been invested over the last 4 years into your PhD research, it's not easy to then step out of it or step aside and think about how a publisher would want you to present a book or a book proposal. So it took me some time to even get that fixed, but in about a couple of months time, I was able to get that through as well, and get that accepted. But yes, I mean, my supervisor unfortunately could not publish his book because the law changed around the world, not just in one country, around the world. In my case, luckily, there have not really been any radical changes ever since 17th of June up until today, 22nd of April. Yes, there have been new judgments. Yes, there have been new decisions in both the US and the European Union. And I already have taken a note of all of that. I'm going to add all of that, maybe around 5,000 odd words more will be added. And then the other bit will be modified. But the idea is two papers out of the way, book is on its way, and that's what best you can do. But of course, as I've said earlier, and to be more precise, Krishna, to your question, if your work will determine whether it's going to be a research monograph or a textbook, it's up to you. It could also be that maybe you could take out 50% of your PhD work and add 50% of new bit to it and turn it into a textbook. That's possible. But then again, topic is the most important thing, which will allow you to do that. I hope I've answered your question.
Wow, Manveen, listen, congratulations on the excellent reception to your work.
Thank you.
Excited to see what happens next. And thank you so much for this conversation. I mean, not only has it been kind of a microcosm of this entire series, because we touched on so many different aspects. Not only has it been enlightening, it has also been inspiring and energizing. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you to the participants, the attendees. Do join us tomorrow for a conversation with Vinay on defense and what comes after. And before we close today, in case I forget tomorrow, I want to really give big thanks to my colleague, Dr. Pratibha Bhosle, who has been the force behind the series, and our colleague from the IT department, Shubham Ji, who has provided excellent technical support. Thank you, Manveen. Thank you, everybody. See you soon. Take care. Good night.
Hi. Thank you. Good night.